Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, today's papers, I did promise you we'd come back to Brexit, or at least the ones based in London and the rest of England, are particularly dominated by coverage of last night's win for England in the World Cup. But there's a big political story that has the more Eurosceptic press worried. The Telegraph says Mrs May faces a cabinet revolt over what it says is the, quote, softest Brexit. The Daily Mail says Theresa May has been warned not to bring back her controversial plan for a customs partnership, while The Sun puts her head in a jelly and says she's heading for the softest Brexit so far. Do you get it? Jelly, soft? Yeah, there you go.
Wobbly.
Anyway, let's talk now to Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's in the central lobby just outside the Commons chamber. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you saw the Tory chief whip yesterday. The chief whip saw you and your fellow Brexiteers this morning. Are you reassured by what he's had to say?
Well, I'm very impressed by the way the chief whip is conducting himself in his role. He is willing to listen to people and understand the concerns that people have.
But are you reassured?
But the chief whip says himself that he doesn't make policy. So we're sending messages via the chief whip to those who will make policy, and the concerns that I have and the broader ERG group have are being represented by him to those who will make the decisions.
Well, let's come on to one particular part of the policies. I tried to explain to you on This Week last Thursday night. Yeah. The government is going to propose that we remain within the single market for goods, and as a consequence will also say we'll remain in regulatory alignment with the EU on these matters. What is your response to that?
That's not Brexit. It's very important that we are not in regulatory alignment, even if we have similar regulations, because we will need to do trade deals with other countries, and the biggest barrier to trade deals is no longer tariffs but non-tariff barriers, and we need to be able to accept from countries with high standards such as Canada and Australia goods that are produced to similar but not identical standards, and if we insist on regulatory alignment we will have nothing to offer them in trade deals. So this would be a serious mistake.
So when, as I'm sure you did, raise this matter with the chief whip, what was his response?
I can't tell you what's said in private meetings. I may be unusual in this, but I think private meetings ought to remain private, so you must ask the chief whip how he responded. All right,
let me come back to my first question then, without details. Were you reassured by what he had to say about a single market in goods?
I won't be reassured until I know the details of what comes out on Friday, one way or the other, that really the chief whip was listening to our concerns. He's not a policy maker, so it wasn't for him to set out policy.
Right. On the other issue, this is more complicated on the customs arrangement. We now understand that it's going to be some kind of amalgam now of the customs partnership or agreement and what's been called MaxFac. It's very, very complicated. I won't get into the details, but there is it involves some form of tariff alignment. How comfortable are you with that?
It's hard to think of a worse idea. What I want to see is the tariffs and non-tariff barriers on food, clothing and footwear removed to ensure that the standard of living of the least well-off in our society is improved. This is a really big economic gain from Brexit. It's a really positive thing and will help the whole of society, but the least well-off most. Bear in mind, over 20% of people's disposable income is spent on food, clothing and footwear. Clothing and footwear are tariffs at over 11%. And food at over 23%. So this would be a real gain, and to give that up would be abandoning the benefit of Brexit. It would be a really foolish policy.
So if the government's position, nevertheless, is to head towards remaining in the single market de facto for goods with the regulations that go with that, and without the kind of freedom on tariffs that you would like, what do you do?
Well, I don't think that would meet the Conservative Party's manifesto, and I think the British electorate would have a right to complain, which is why I think that the government won't do this. I think it would be essentially tearing up the manifesto and keeping us as a vassal state, essentially tied into the European Union without the freedoms that people voted for.
You say the government isn't going to do this,
well,
but
we'll
this
see on
is
Friday.
what the Prime Minister is going to propose to the... We don't know all the details, obviously, but in this direction, I'm in no doubt about this, and I'm sure you aren't either, that this is the direction that the Prime Minister is going to propose to the Cabinet. Now, if the Cabinet accepts this, what do you do?
Well, there are so many ifs in that.
Not really, just one.
If the Prime Minister suggests it, if the Cabinet accepts it, what then
Well,
do
no,
I do?
the Prime Minister is going to suggest this.
Well, we don't know that, do we?
Yes, we do.
The political correspondent of ITV thinks he knows exactly what's going to happen, but it hasn't been formally announced. And I think we've slightly got to wait and see what happens and how the Cabinet reacts to this and whether the Cabinet would accept such a proposal if put forward. So I think we ought to have another conversation next week once we know what's actually been proposed. I think we're getting much too speculative.
Well, we're almost there. It's Wednesday, and we've got a pretty idea, particularly on the good side. I mean, that's not really being disputed by the government, that that's what they're going to suggest. But let me put this to you. The government says, at least in private, that there simply isn't a majority in Parliament for the kind of Brexit you want.
Well,
what do you say to that?
There's been a majority in Parliament to pass the Article 50 bill into law and to pass the withdrawal from the European Union into law. So Parliament has already put the key blocks for leaving in. If nothing happens between now and the 29th of March 2019, we leave without a deal. That is our law. So currently, Parliament has a majority for leaving established in British and EU law. That's a pretty powerful position to be in.
Except that Parliament could change that. If there is no deal, Parliament could decide that rather than go to the no deal option and we just come out, Parliament could decide to keep us in the EEA and in the Customs Union for the foreseeable future, and Brussels could go along with that. It's not done that we crash out.
Hold on, because when you say Parliament, you say that, yes, theoretically Parliament can legislate, but you must remember that the government controls the legislative timetable, that legislation on private members' bills on Fridays doesn't go through unless it has almost unanimous support. So what you're saying is that the government would have to bring through a bill calling for us to remain within the EEA, and the Prime Minister has been absolutely clear that she is opposed to that. So you're speculating, actually, that the pro-Europeans would try to bring down the government. But I think that's very unlikely. I think that most Conservatives are fully backing Mrs May and want the government to carry on.
Your father was a journalist. You keep your ear to the ground. You will know that the government is briefing out that no deal is now not an option. That's what we're being told.
Well, the government is also briefing out, and I absolutely accept, Mr Neil, that the lobby is very often better informed than backbench MPs as to what the government's thinking is on a particular day, but sometimes it speculates on things to see what the reaction is rather than having determined them, because the government is also briefing that it's doing a lot more on preparing for no deal than it has so far made public. So there are two different stories coming out via the lobby, and your guess is as good as mine as to which one represents the real position.
Can we agree, though, that from what we know so far, and from all the mood music, you are not going to get the kind of Brexit you want?
We'll wait and see. We'll have to see what the withdrawal and implementation bill says, what it proposes. We'll have to see what comes out of the Cabinet meeting on Friday, and then how votes fall in the Houses of Parliament. We're a long way from my feeling that we're not going to get the type of Brexit, not that I want, but that the country voted for. 17.4 million people voted to be free from the European Union, and for the great economic opportunities that will bring, the ability to take back control, the reinvigoration of our democracy.
No, we know all that.
I know, but sometimes it's forgotten.
Right.
We get into the weeds and we forget this glorious opportunity that the nation is taking for itself.
Okay, well, let me drag you back to the weeds, if I may, for a minute. If the Cabinet does agree to broadly what I've been suggesting will be the government's position, where does that leave you? Where does that leave you and your fellow Brexiteers? Are you prepared to defy the government if that is the direction it goes in?
Well, I will give you a specific example. If the agreement from the Cabinet is that we will give the European Union £39 billion merely on the good faith of the EU's negotiating a trade deal, I will vote against that. I don't think I can be clearer than that. I don't know the details, and I think that position is unlikely. But if that were to emerge, of course I would vote against it, and many others would too.
My colleague Laura Kunsberg is here. You will know her well. Laura, what would you like to ask Jacob Rees-Mogg?
I just wonder, Jacob Rees-Mogg, do you trust cabinet ministers on your side of the argument to make these points firmly enough? Because if you did trust them to make the argument, you wouldn't have to be scurrying around demanding to see the Chief Whip this morning, would you?
Well, I don't think there was any scurrying. I think there was a gentle amble to see the
scurrying,
Chief Whip.
however you want to describe it. But do you trust those people on your side of the argument who are meant to be putting your case around the cabinet table?
Yes, of course I do. But it's important that people know that the cabinet ministers on my side of the argument represent a large body of support within the party. And the numbers of MPs who turned up to a meeting at less than 12 hours' notice, they didn't know the meeting room until 20 minutes before, and we had jolly nearly 50 MPs turn up to see the Chief Whip. I think that shows that there is deep-seated support within the Conservative benches for delivering on the Brexit that was in the manifesto and that the Prime Minister promised in her Mansion House speech, Florence and Lancaster House speech.
How powerless is the government's position now on this?
Well, actually, I think the real problem for the government has been the recent decline in collective responsibility, with ministers taking random potshots at each other, and that needs to stop because that's very debilitating to any government. And if we get out of Friday a reassertion of collective responsibility, that would be very important. And then we can get back to considering the details of Brexit.
So you think ministers should leave the random potshots to you?
Backbenchers are not bound by collective responsibility.
No, I understand.
And that's very important because constitutionally our system of government becomes very difficult without collective responsibility.
Are you aware yet, do you have a broad idea of what is going to be proposed on the customs arrangements? I mean, as I say, we've got a harder idea of what they plan on traded goods and the costs that could come with that. Do you have any idea, a broader idea, of what is now happening, some kind of amalgam of the customs partnership and the max-fac, the high-tech facilitation approach?
All I know is what has been reported by various correspondents like Laura as to what the government is proposing. I don't know whether those will turn out to be what the government decides in the end. What I've heard so far is concerning and would not be a sensible way to run our economy after we've left the European Union.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, we thank you for your time this morning. We'll leave it there. We'll let you get in to Prime Minister's questions. Is it not quite remarkable, to employ British understatement, that at the beginning of July, with only a couple of weeks to go to the summer recess, and that we still don't really have a clue on some of the biggest issues affecting Brexit?
Well, Andrew, I think we've been at this stage for every single part of the Brexit negotiations. It's been to the wire, and that's only natural. We are in massively uncharted territory. This is a huge decision.
But we don't even know what your government's position is yet. That's the point. Not that you still got to do the negotiations. It's not a situation that, oh, we're going down to the wire with Brussels because we've demanded A and they're insisting on B. We don't even know what A is yet.
But it's only natural that over something like this, which has got such massive consequences for the whole of the UK, that people will have wildly different views on exactly how we do it.
Yeah, but we'd just like to know what the government's view is.
Well, and the government will be thrashing out a final way forward on Friday when they all meet at Chequers, and I think what will happen is that those who are outliers on both ends of the spectrum will have to give a little, and we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle.
But I'm informed that this white paper, and I don't know whether you've had this or not, Laura, This white paper won't actually deal with what for many was the biggest issue in the referendum, which was migration. That this white paper will not tell us what the government's position on EU migration is. Now, that's not remarkable, I would suggest. That's incredible.
Well, you're better informed than I am, clearly,
Yeah.
but I think that... but
Sometimes happens.
But I think, you know,
But
I'm
you
not
still don't know your position in government on migration post-Brexit.
Look, I'm the Care Minister, I'm not the Brexit Minister, I'm not in the Cabinet. But the Cabinet will, you know, we're all very clear what we want out of this. You know, we want to deliver what the country voted for, which is, you know, a free movement of money and control over our borders and over our legal system. And that's what the Cabinet have to thrash out on Friday.
Very well. I want to come on to Labour on this, but just before we do, I'd like to show you the Unite Union, biggest union, big bankroller of the Labour Party too. It said on a motion that this week, I think it was, that they were open to the possibility of a popular vote being held on any deal. And the Executive Council of the union had the power to respond to a fast-changing political situation. Given everything you hear, why would Labour not want a second referendum on the deal, this time on the deal?
Well, that's not Labour's position, as you know.
But
What
I
we've
know.
been,
Why not?
Well, because our focus has been, and we've been very disappointed that we haven't persuaded government yet on this, but we're going to keep trying. We think there needs to be a meaningful vote in Parliament on that deal. Now, we've managed to drag from government at least having a vote on the deal. They didn't initially want to allow that level of democratic engagement, so at least we're going to have a vote on the deal. But we need it to be meaningful. That's what we're focused on.
Right, but what is your position on a second, I call it a second referendum, but of course the first referendum was in or out. This would be a referendum on whether we accept the deal or not. What is Labour's position on that?
Well, we're not proposing that kind of a referendum. As you're probably aware, Jeremy's made very clear that we're not proposing that.
But you seem to tap dance around it. You don't say we're against it. We don't want another referendum. You say it's not our position.
Well, Labour thinks it's important that we stick to what we committed to at the last election. Now, if I can just contrast what we're talking about now, where Labour's been consistent and where we've been listening as well to business and other stakeholders, particularly around customs, with what we've just seen, where we've seen our country's policy making being driven by a very small number of Conservative MPs and every other stakeholder being told to put up or shut up. I think there's quite a big difference there. That's the difference between Labour and the Conservatives on this.
Will you rule out a second referendum on the deal or not?
Well, it's not Labour policy to have that second referendum.
Why do you answer in that way? People know what you're doing. You're keeping your options open, aren't you?
I'm not personally keeping my options open. As you know,
Why use that language?
I campaigned to remain because
I know.
but I accept the result. And I think it's necessary on democratic politicians to deliver that. What is not appropriate is a small number of politicians like Jacob Rees-Mogg deciding for all of us. That means we have an extreme Brexit and a Brexit that harms business, which is what he's focusing on.
What he wants, but the evidence whether he gets it's another matter.